Going to be using 30 minutes to talk about how to make sure that projects you're creating on Tasking Manager are good size or right sizing projects. We might have some minutes at the end and we can use that for questions, but feel free to drop questions in the chat as well. I guess the kind of prerequisite for anyone following this process, if you were to try and repeat this, is that I'm going to be showing JOSM, and it kind of, the expectation is you might have JOSM set up. And I'm also going to be showing how to create projects. So the expectation is you have enough access to Tasking Manager that you can create projects. If you don't have access to Tasking Manager to create projects, then you could consider doing that. And you can do that by applying to be an organizational community that doesn't already exist on Tasking Manager. Yes, I'm going to be showing you how you might quickly obtain an area of interest or boundary for a disaster area. I'm going to be showing you how you might identify an appropriate size for a Tasking Manager project or several Tasking Manager projects to split that area of interest up. And then I'm going to talk about how to ensure that within that project, the small tasks are the right size, basically are small enough. And then also I'm going to kind of be zooming out a bit and talking about how you can make sure you sequence projects or you release projects in such a way that it kind of optimizes the level of contributions towards those projects and reduces the risk of projects not being finished. Why is this short session important? Why is talking about correct sizes of projects important? I would say one of the main things that we're trying to avoid here is incomplete projects. And here it's mean to pick one out, but I'm picking one out that's still active project in Morocco that was published in September 2023, many months ago. It's still active, and you can see it's still not complete. Lots of the project is still waiting to be validated. Lots of tasks have been invalidated, so I've gone back to community for more mapping. It's had almost 5,000 contributors, and the imagery has been updated since the project was launched, so it's probably never going to get completed. And this is the kind of data issues that exist in this area. That this city here is actually Marrakesh, so it's a very big, globally recognized city, and lots of it is badly mapped because of this project. This actually is an area outside of Marrakesh that's zoomed into one of these tasks which have been marked as having bad mapping. So this is some of the mapping that's in this project. You can see these are buildings that have been mapped. You can see that multiple buildings have been mapped as very large buildings. This is kind of a non-starter. This would need to be mapped from scratch. So this is why it's important to make sure projects are good size. What's our task as a project creator? What are we thinking about when we're creating projects? What do we need to keep in mind? What we need to try and do is we need to try and what I'm calling here match the curve. This here is the edit activity of the Morocco earthquake response. Multiple projects over 3 months. This is showing actually, or just over 2 months. This is showing daily editing activity. As a project creator, what you need to try and do is you need to try and scale your projects, match your projects to this activity. You need to try and get your projects effectively under that curve. If you're creating projects that are too large, they're not going to end up matching this level of activity, and they're not going to get completed. And what we can see here is a very common pattern. The first 3 weeks of an activation are where so much activity happens. And after the 3rd week, the activity drops off really rapidly. Okay. So actually you can see for the Morocco earthquake response, over 500,000 edits occurred in the first 3 weeks, and only about 100,000 edits occurred in the following 3 weeks. So it's all about those first 3 weeks. Just showing how this pattern is repeated. This is the Turkey earthquake, Turkey-Syria earthquake. February 2023. Similar thing, first 3 weeks, almost all the activities there. Okay. This is because, it's hard to say exactly why, but probably because a lot of the news pieces are going to be around that time, right? The big news publications are going to be pushing hard on the news and releasing a lot of news about these disasters. People are going to notice that and they're going to contribute. So partially that, but also there are other disaster response campaigns that come in and they start to compete for good reason. And so people move off to more interesting ones, more relevant ones as well. So our advice here, my advice here, is avoid publishing several large projects all at once. It's super difficult to predict and to try and match your project sizes to that curve, to the amount of contributions that you might expect. So to give yourself the best chance of making the right prediction, what I would recommend is don't try and predict everything up front and publish everything all up front, but instead break up the area that needs to be mapped into several small projects and release those projects slowly. Wait for a project to be fully mapped and fully validated and then release the next one. So instead, what you're doing is something like this. Okay, these projectiles are meant to indicate projects. You're releasing the first project after the activation occurs. It gets mapped really quickly because look at the activity, it's way up here. So you release the next project really quickly. You then release the next project after that quite quickly, but maybe not as quickly as the first one was released. And as the activity curve starts to pull away, as people become less interested in this disaster response, you're spacing out these releases and you're ending up maybe with a final project, which is just gradually improved until it reaches 100%. You're archiving that and maybe calling it to a close. My argument here is that the advantages of going for small projects, which are sequenced, as in released one at a time, massively outweigh the disadvantages of taking that approach. So there are some disadvantages of using small projects in a sequence way, but let's just talk first about the advantages. So the first big advantage of doing small sequence projects is that you do minimize the chances of incomplete projects. Okay, because you're releasing one project at a time and you're waiting until it's 100% mapped, 100% validated. The only project which is maybe not going to get 100% completed is the last project in your series. Okay. And as this third point says, even if that final project in your series is incomplete, that's annoying that it was incomplete. It wasn't fully mapped, fully validated, but at least it was small. At least it was a small project, so that you could say to people who are interested in this data, hey, listen, like most of these projects were completed in these areas, but there was just one small part that still needs checking. Maybe just be aware of that. Okay. Compare that to a situation where you have a huge project which hasn't been completed and you're not clear which areas were mapped well, which areas were not mapped well, scattered all around, right? Which is typically what happens. When you have several small projects, it also allows you to prioritize geographic areas more effectively. There is, in Tasking Manager, the ability to define or draw a priority area within a project. That's kind of helpful. It's kind of useful, but it's actually not as powerful or as impactful as just releasing projects in such a way that the top priority areas are the first projects that you release. Okay. You also have much more control over when to call an activation to a close. If you've got small projects, it's more difficult to call an activation to a close if you've got a very large project which is still not making much progress and you're finding it difficult because it's still not validated and there's lots of bad data. It's much harder to call that kind of thing to a close than to say no more mapping when you've got a situation like that. Whereas if you had a small project that made a little bit of progress, maybe was 70% mapped, 70% validated, much easier to say, yeah, we're done at this stage. Unfortunately, this project's not going to get finished, but at least it's fully validated. The other thing is that from a user experience, from a contributor experience, it's much more motivating to see a project make visible progress. Okay, over a day, a couple of days, they're seeing the percentage tick up. If it's an extremely large project, that progress is going to be very, very slow. And I would say it's demotivating to see that. Okay. Finally, big advantage. We need to be, as project creators and project managers, we need to be very responsive to the community when they spot errors in our projects. And even when you design very well, very nicely crafted projects, there's going to be things that need to be improved about it down the line. If you have a series of small projects, if you're creating projects one at a time and releasing them one at a time and they're small, it's much easier and less disruptive to tweak those projects to change things. Let's say if you need to change the imagery, that's usually a very kind of disruptive change to make to a large project. If you switched imagery from Bing to Mapbox, that would have a big impact on a big project. Okay, it would make a mess. But if you had several projects that were small and you switched halfway through and you use the end of one project and the start of another to make that change, it's way less disruptive. So many other examples like that. Changing features, your mapping, changing instructions, it's going to make it much easier if you've got small projects. Downsides, okay, there are downsides of having small projects. The project creator has to spend more time creating projects, okay? Because they're splitting an area up, it takes longer to create those projects. Also, the project creator or the person who's coordinating the response, who's managing all of these projects, does lose more time keeping track of project progress. They need to be on top of their projects as they make progress, and they need to make sure that they are publishing projects quickly as soon as the previous one is finished. Okay, that is a time sink, granted. And related to that, there is a risk, therefore, if the coordinator of a response is away from their desk, is not on top of things, and loses track, there is a risk that a small project is completed in a response, and half a day, 2 days, 3 days is lost to mapping because the next project in the series is not published. Okay, that risk is not really present with very, very large projects. If projects are split up, that can be a risk. So it's worth saying that that's a risk. It means that the project, the person who's creating the projects, the person who's responsible for publishing needs to keep on top of things. Okay, just before I jump into the demo, just as important as project size, task size. Okay, and generally I'd say the argument is the same here. Try and go quite small. Tasks are the little areas within a project that are broken up, right? They're the small squares usually that are broken up inside of a project. They are for individual mappers to work on. Generally speaking, you should go for small tasks. And what we tell people as a rule of thumb is to go for tasks that are approximately 15 minutes of work. Okay, that can vary. If it's a buildings mapping project and the buildings are densely built, tasks are going to be tiny for 15 minutes of work. If it's a roads project mapping roads and it's a rural area, tasks might be huge. Okay, 15 minutes of work might be a very big area. But try and hit that 15 minutes, more or less. Why is it good to go for small tasks? Well, if you've got small tasks, when someone loads a task and they look at it on their screen, they're going to be more motivated when they see an area like this in the bottom right than if they look at this, right? This huge area with thousands of buildings and loads of roads. It's going to be demotivating for them if they just see this massive area. It's a good user experience to see at a glance what you need to map. And another strong advantage is on the feedback and comments. Validators know this. If you're giving feedback to someone based on their work in a task, it's much easier to give feedback if it's a small task because your feedback is very specific and you don't need to talk about too much. If you've got a massive task and there's issues all over the place and there are different corners and there's different features all over this massive task that have been mapped, much harder to give direct, easy feedback, right? You have many, many sentences of feedback indeed. Now, there are disadvantages of small tasks. One of the disadvantages you need to weigh against is that more time needs to be spent by contributors if the tasks are smaller. More time needs to be spent by them updating the task status. And that's the stage where after a bit of mapping, after they're saved, They stop mapping and it asks them, is the task fully mapped or not? Now that's a couple clicks and it's a consideration, right, by the mapper. It takes time to do that. So if you're splitting your area up into lots and lots of small tasks, you do need to keep that in consideration. Time's going to be lost in updating task statuses. The other downside of having small tasks is that there are more what we call edge effects. The edges of tasks are problematic. People often don't map buildings at edges. People don't connect highways at edges. People change classes of highways when they go from one area of a task to the next. These are issues that are very difficult to avoid, and we often see them. Those issues are going to be more frequent. You're going to see more of them if there are more edges in your project, and there's going to be more edges if you've got more tasks. So you do need to balance these disadvantages against the advantages, and there's a kind of middle ground, and that's what the 15-minute recommendation is. Okay, there's a balance. Roughly speaking, we say go for 15 minutes. Now, I know that University of Cameroon is doing some research on this, so I hope in a few months to have like objective evidence to share with you about this, but this is more based on kind of long-term experience effectively. Okay, now let's jump quickly into demo. The first demo I want to show you is how to pull an area of interest for a disaster response and how to split it up. Okay, one of the ways to get an area of interest is to go to the GDAX website, which is the Global Disaster Alert and Coordination System website. This is the one that actually feeds into the alerts channel in hot Slack. You can get areas of interest from this website related to disasters. There are lots of different ways of getting areas of interest related to disaster. This is not necessarily the best way. There are many other ways. In many situations, it's going to be much better to have a strong line of communication with the local OpenStreetMap community, with a local organization in the area, and for them to share with you an area of interest. But here's an example of how you might do this just kind of remotely, and if you're quite rushed. Okay, so on the GDAX website, if you go to alerts, this is going to show you recent alerts related to disasters, and they're sorted by the date they occurred. And if you go into one, like this is the Cyclone Dikeledi, which actually HOT and the Eastern Southern African Hub did respond to. We've got the date here, January 17th. We can click into this. You can get a bunch of information. The bit that we're interested in here is actually resources. There's a little map here that shows you a bit of information, but we're going to go into resources here, and we're going to download the event GeoJSON. Right, it's this URL. A little bit janky. This, if you click on that URL, it opens up a web page. So you don't click on the URL, you actually right-click on it and select Save Link As. And then just save that down, right? Let's just call this Cyclone. Let's just call it 2025. Now I'm just going to rename that GeoJSON. By default, that's JSON. Let's just call it GeoJSON so it opens up nicely in JOSM. And let's open up JOSM and pull that event shape in. So this is the track of the cyclone, right? It started over here and went west. It went through northern Madagascar and then came down here. The bit we're interested in, let's say, is northern Madagascar. I'm going to take this kind of shape that intersects northern Madagascar. I'm going to click it and copy, and I'm going to drop it into a new layer. So I'm going to just go Control N. So I'm in JOSM here. Control N for a new data layer, and then you can paste it in place quickly. So you go Control Alt V, Control Alt V. So I'm using Windows combinations here. So that's pasting in place. So I've got a new layer with that shape in, and I can just get rid of that old layer. Sorry, I'm going through things quite quickly here because I know we've only got 8 minutes. I did before this get the administrative boundaries for Madagascar from HDX. So just share a link to that. what you would search for there is Madagascar admin boundaries and download those. So I got a couple levels of admin boundaries here. Let's show you this first one. We've got kind of wider, bigger regions of Madagascar, which is they're probably slightly too big for a project. And then we've got smaller regions, these shapes for Madagascar. So approach here, quite a common approach to take is to use existing boundaries, right? One of the approaches I could have taken is just I could have taken this polygon and I could have started splitting it into bits, right? Manually shaping it and getting the bit that intersects the part of northern Madagascar. But often a good approach is to actually use existing boundaries, so administrative boundaries. So like, let's do that for this. I maybe want to just take these boundaries on the coast, a couple of these boundaries on the coast, right? Let's just take these three, because I know that they intersect that kind of area of interest I had, and they're also on the East Coast, which got hit first. So I'm going to take these and drop them in a new layer, right? Another new layer and put them in place. There's a bunch of other stuff you would be doing before this, potentially, right? You would be checking to see if these areas were well mapped. You'd be potentially reaching out to the local community. If not, you were the local community, be reaching out to your colleagues to hear about where a priority within these regions were. You might be talking to other organizations to work out where they plan to work, where their priorities are. But I'm kind of simplifying things here. I've got 3 shapes here. Super valuable tool in the JOSM is the measurement tool. So if I select one of these shapes, I quickly get a area. So it says that this area is going to be small for you, but it's about 700 kilometers squared. And this one is about 650 kilometers squared. So these are actually kind of okay sizes for projects. Our recommendation is to avoid creating projects larger than 1,000 square kilometers. But you may often be creating projects much smaller than that. Now, I might want to split this one, just to show you a quick split. I might want to split this one because it's actually half of it falls outside of the that kind of area that the cyclone passed. So I can do that quickly, right? I can, I'm actually going to copy just this one into a new layer. Let's say I'm going to proceed to use this one as a first project. Super quick way of doing this. I'm just going to select a couple nodes here. And then you can use a keyboard shortcut on JOSM to split objects really nicely and create polygons. You go Alt-X with 2 nodes selected, and that's created 2 polygons. I'm going to delete this one. Now I've got the polygon I want to create a project from, let's say, right? So I'm going to save this, okay? I'm just going to do a fail-safe thing, which is I'm going to delete all of the attributes that this object has, tags in JOSM, delete them all and add a generic area equals yes to make sure it's recognized as an area in Tasking Manager. And I'm going to go ahead and save that into, let's just put it in here as a GeoJSON. Right, this is my project. This is one I want to create. It's just checking the size, double checking the size. It's 383 kilometers squared. Decent, not too big, not too large. Like if it was close to 1,000, I would probably split it. But that often depends on how built out the area is you're looking at. I'm going to go straight to Tasking Manager, create a project from this test project. So if you do have management access to Tasking Manager, you go to Manage, New Project, and I'm going to select the file. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. Here's our project, right? Useful often to look at existing project extents, which it does show you. There are actually existing projects here. That would be useful to know. Let's pretend there are none. Here's the bit I really want to demonstrate to you. Making sure your task size is appropriate, right? By default, this task size is enormous. So we're going to start splitting the tasks. And each time I select smaller, it's going to make them smaller. And here, this is what I'm thinking about, this 15-minute objective. I'm going to get my task down to 15 minutes. So where we have rural areas like this, where there's very few buildings, it's probably appropriate to have very large squares. So I could probably make them even larger. So we've got rural areas with very few buildings and very few roads, probably appropriate to have larger tasks. Now, let's say the coastal area was built up. I could, and you should, manually split any areas that are kind of built up. So I can use this draw area to split tool. And I can zoom into the Bing imagery, which I've activated here. I can check for built up areas. And let's say I could see a bunch of built up areas along the coast that needed more intense mapping. So I'm drawing a polygon along the coast, and that's going to manually split those tasks. I can go ahead and do that again if I want to split again. Like, let's say this is a built up settlement. And I can keep splitting until I'm kind of happy with this hierarchy of tasks I've got. I've got ones out in these rural areas, pretty big, ones in these semi-rural areas, medium size, and I've got small ones in the densest areas, right? I can then go ahead and trim the area, trim the tasks, which is highly recommended to avoid getting people mapping outside of your area of interest. And then it's always good to just check, like, how many tasks does my project have? It's got about 150 tasks. Equal recommendation we have here, try and keep your projects under 1,000 tasks. But actually, that's quite a high number. Ideally, kind of 400 or less is decent. Okay. Now, that was a lightning run through, but I have covered the things I wanted to cover in the demo there. Any questions in the last couple of minutes about anything I've gone through there? This is a fake project, so I'm going to delete it, of course.
Is there currently, is that the best way to select the areas that you'd like to split further? Is just using that polygon? Is there no way to save that selection so that you can, say, split the same area multiple times?
That's an important question. Yeah. So the project creator can only do splitting en masse at that stage. They can split multiple times, as I was showing there. You split once and then I split again. After that stage, once they go through to the next stage of project creation, it's not possible to split tasks en masse like that. It's then down to the individual contributors to split tasks individually, which is a big time waster, really, on the community. So yeah, it's important at that early stage to do the splitting en masse to an appropriate size. The other way I've seen people do task splitting is to manually create a grid using the kind of grid creation tools in QGIS, and then to split using QGIS tools, and then to upload that grid into Tasking Manager. So it's like you do it offline, basically, using QGIS. And yeah, there's a special toggle in Tasking Manager to say, I want to use the boundary file I'm uploading is actually not only my boundary file, it's also my defined tasks. Yeah. Is that helpful, Gregor? I don't know if I've answered.
No, that's definitely helpful, yeah, because there's another way of doing it that's outside the...
Yeah.
Well, if you think that a certain tool might be better for drawing the geometry, then
yeah,
that's really helpful, yeah.
Yeah. Any final questions before we close off?
I guess this is only about urgent projects. I missed the beginning of the meeting. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I would say this is focused particularly on disaster response projects. But
yeah.
I would say a lot of this applies to any type of project. And
because I was thinking about MapSwipe.
Yeah.
The story changes a bit, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I want to do one of these sessions purely on MapSwipe and MapSwipe project, because actually where I showed you there, Madagascar, probably inappropriate to do what I just did there. because very rural areas.
Mm.
Actually, the approach that was taken in this response, the Declady response, was to use MapSwipe first to focus in on built-up areas, and then to create a separate project, to create a project that way. So I do want to cover that at some point, actually, in another one of these sessions,
Okay,
which is like, how do you do this if you've got an extremely rural area, where you do want to avoid asking your volunteers just to be trawling through endless amounts of satellite imagery looking for built-up areas.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.